Papua in the 1960s and the involvement of the United Nations, which is important in this process. I'm going to begin by talking about the events leading up to the Dutch departure from their colony and the signing of something that was called the New York Agreement, which was a UN brokered agreement between Indonesia and the Netherlands. And then following this, I'll have a look at the agreement itself and see how it was actually implemented. And I'll be looking particularly at the preparations and the events from 1969, which was mentioned earlier both in the film and previously, and this what was called this Act of Free Choice. So to begin, I'll start with a summary of the events from the transfer of West Papua from Dutch to Indonesian rule. So I'm going to have to skim over this, but please try and bear with me. Until October 62, West Papua was a non-self-governing territory and was recognised by the UN as such, and has been prepared for independence by the Dutch. There was a West New Guinea council. There had been actual elections for this council, partial elections, and they were well on the way to independence, just as in that period of the early 60s, a lot of countries around the world, just like Africa or African countries, were doing the same. But West Papua's journey towards independence faced a major stumbling block, and that was President Sukarno of Indonesia. Now, he argued that Indonesia should have sovereignty over all the territories that had been ruled by the Dutch East Indies, and that included West Papua. But the Dutch replied that they'd only administered West Papua as part of the Dutch East Indies because their small presence there did not warrant it being a separate colony. But more importantly, the Dutch argued that the Melanesian West Papuans, as I think we can see, bore no ethnic, cultural affinity or historical affinity with the Indonesians. But in September 61, as Indonesian threats of war intensified, Washington, which was under Kennedy, decided the best solution was for Sukarno to get his way. And they decided therefore to put pressure on the Netherlands to negotiate. And as a result, the Dutch reluctantly agreed to sign up to what was this New York Agreement with Jakarta in August of 62. I'd like to spend just a little time looking at this New York Agreement because it was an agreement which at first glance you could argue resolved what was a troublesome colonial conflict, and it also set the West Papuans supposedly on the path towards self-determination. And I'll look at the pros and cons of this from a West Papuan point of view, beginning with the cons for this agreement. Under the plan, West Papua was to be handed over to a UN administration. That was the first time the UN had ever administered a territory. But the UN was then free to transfer West Papua over to an Indonesian administration before any act of self-determination had taken place. And the agreement was also deliberately vague about what the method would be for self-determination. There was no mention of referendum or plebiscite. And of course you could argue in that case that it was really nothing more than a tool to allow the Dutch to leave with a sort of modicum of self-respect. But on the other side, despite all the failings, the New York Agreement did give the Papuans certain rights Indonesia as a signatory was obligated to enforce. And to list through just a few of them, under Article 22, the UN and Indonesia, and I'll quote here, had to guarantee fully the rights, including the rights of free speech, freedom of movement and assembly of the Papuans. And of course, despite any reference to a plebiscite, Article 18 of this guaranteed the rights of all adult Papuans to participate in an act of self-determination to be carried out in accordance with international practice. In the urban areas, there should be a one-person, one-vote, whilst in other areas there be some sort of representative collective consultation. But Indonesia completely ignored this, and instead a series of Indonesian orchestrated committees were They selected a number of officially approved candidates from each region to vote supposedly on behalf of the people. Now, the result of this selection process in London, he said that UN member states wanted the issue cleared out of the way with a minimum of fuss. He added in this quote, he said, they're only too anxious to get shot of the whole problem as quickly as possible. So in the end, the United Nations General Assembly simply washed its hands of of West Papua. So I'd just like to recap on this little bit of history, if I can. Under the New York Agreement, the Netherlands, Indonesia and the UN had an obligation to protect the political rights and freedoms of the West Papuans, and this did not happen. And it's clear that these rights and freedoms have been systematically abused in the years since. The New York Agreement also specified that a West Papuan act of self-determination should take place in accordance with international practice. And again, this didn't happen. This so-called act of free choice with a unanimous vote bore absolutely no relation to accepted practice at the time or now. So more than 40 years later, as we know and from the film and earlier, West Papua remains under an Indonesian occupation in which the countless thousands, tens of thousands died, and the people still wait for genuine self-determination. Again, as I think was mentioned earlier, what they've been offered instead, more recently, is special autonomy. But less than 2 years after the 2001 Special Autonomy Bill was passed, its legitimacy was undermined when Jakarta split the territory into 3 provinces. It's a typical divide and rule tactic. Justice on Kosovo, in which it ruled that the territory's 2008 declaration of independence from Serbia did not violate international law. I think interestingly to that, there was a submission to the court by the Dutch, who, as we might remember, were the West Papuans' original colonial rulers, and they explained their support for Kosovan independence by stating, they said, the people of Kosovo had the right to self-determination and succession from Serbia because the Belgrade authorities systematically violated civil and human rights of Albanians for years. International law thus allows the proclamation of Kosovo's independence. You could swap Serbia, Indonesia, West Papua, Kosovo, and what you can see, it would be interesting to know how the Dutch government actually responds to this, because unfortunately for the West Papuans over many years, the Dutch have kept fairly quiet since they gave over the colony. So to conclude, a proper resolution, I'd argue, of the West Papuan conflict requires genuine negotiations without any preconditions from either side. And this would undoubtedly be helped by Indonesia's abandonment of its distorted version of history, which I think can only further distort current efforts to solve the situation peacefully. Thank you very much.